The Italian Grand Prix is over and that marks the end of the European portion of the season, and now it is time for the flyaway races, and the first race is the Singapore Grand Prix, and that means it is time for my preview and predictions. This is a series where I'll be previewing, and then at the end of the video I'll be giving out my early predictions for the upcoming Grand Prix. Now, let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be talking about McLaren, Aston Martin, Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull later on, so stick around for that. The Singapore Grand Prix could not be any more different from the Monza circuit if it tried. The Monza circuit is typically the fastest race of the year, and teams bring the lowest possible levels of downforce. Singapore, however, is the second slowest race of the year, and is usually close to the 2-hour time limit, and the teams bring the highest levels of downforce to this circuit, which means once again behind Red Bull we are likely to see a completely different running order. The high downforce required means teams like Williams may struggle a little bit more this weekend than they did last time out at Monza, and Alpine will be looking to bounce back towards the top of the midfield after a dismal weekend last time out. The Singapore Grand Prix sees the return of street circuits for Formula 1 after a run of racing on full-time circuits. And because it is a street circuit, Pirelli will be bringing the C3, C4 and C5 compound of tyres, just like they did at Monza. Street circuits typically require the softest tyres in the range as the grip is lower, and also the average speed of the circuit is pretty low. This leads to more grippy tyres being required. Even though Singapore is brutally hot, tyre wear is actually pretty low, and because of that, last year there was only a total of 21 pit stops. Although of course the weather played into the race, it was still actually a one stop for the majority of teams, apart from George Russell, who had a bit of a shocking race. Even though it is the softest tyres in the Pirelli range, I still anticipate it will be a one-stop race, and probably even more so with the removal of the tight and twisty corners in Sector 3, which would typically have required traction from the rear tyres. With Singapore being a street circuit, overtaking is, as you would expect, not very easy. And last year, even with it being a rain-affected race, there was only a total of 16 on-track overtakes. The wet race actually probably didn't help, as the circuit dried slowly off the racing line and DRS was not made available for quite a while. And speaking of DRS, the Singapore circuit, as of right now, features 3 DRS zones to help with some overtaking. The first DRS zone is on the run down Raffles Boulevard into turn 7, the second DRS zone is on the exit of turn 13 into turn 14, and the third and final DRS zone is on the run down the pit straight into turn 1. If the race is fully dry, we can hopefully see a little bit more on-track racing, with some more overtaking than what we did get to see last year. Last year's pole position lap time was a 1:49.412 and was set by Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari during a wet to dry qualifying session, and in the race the fastest lap was a 1:46.458 and was set by George Russell in the Mercedes whilst he was doing his million pit stops. These times are fairly irrelevant for this year, as not only should the race weekend hopefully be fully dry, but the new layout should lead to much faster lap times, with the race itself expecting to be extended by a couple of laps to compensate for the new layout from 61 to 62 laps. I just want to say that if you are enjoying the video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe for more F1 content. I'm on my way to 5k subs and I would really appreciate it if you help me get there. Now though, let's get back to the video and let's talk about the top 5 teams, and let's start with McLaren. For McLaren, the Singapore Grand Prix should be an improved race for them. McLaren really struggled at Monza with a low downforce setup, as they didn't quite have the straight line speed to compensate, especially against the Williams team. However, Singapore is all about downforce, as that is much more important than straight line performance, and this is where they somewhat excel now. In Zandvoort and Budapest they were mighty strong in qualifying, and I anticipate that this will be the case again in Singapore. The thing that might work against them is that McLaren have been harder on their tyres when compared to Mercedes and Aston Martin, who could potentially go well this weekend. With there being less tight and twisty sections on the circuit though, I anticipate that following and overtaking may be a little bit easier, and whilst I think they could be the closest contenders to Red Bull in qualifying, the race could be a different story. For Lando, he is consistently getting the most out of the car, so I expect he should be the driver closest to Verstappen over one lap. For Piastri, however, he just needs to make sure he can have a clean race. He has the pace, but currently is harder on his tyres when compared to Norris, and also seems to be finding himself getting involved in a few more incidents. If he can have a clean race, then good points should be available for him. For Aston Martin, the Italian Grand Prix was a difficult weekend, and they now find themselves slipping to 4th in the Constructors' Championship, and that always somewhat had a feeling of inevitability, as Ferrari and Mercedes were improving the car with two great drivers, whereas Aston Martin always feels like they have one arm time behind their back because of Lance Stroll. That being said, Singapore should be a great race for them as a team, and Fernando Alonso has the opportunity, I think, to find himself potentially on the podium once again. The circuit characteristics suit their car nicely, as they tend to get great traction on the exit corners, which is ideal at the Singapore circuit due to the number of 90-degree corners. The new layout could be a bit of a disadvantage for them with the removal of some of the tight chicanes, but I do anticipate that they will go well in the race, and they will be in the fight against McLaren and Mercedes, at least with Fernando Alonso. For Ferrari, the Italian Grand Prix was, for the first few laps, the dream scenario, as Carlos Sainz was leading and Charles Leclerc was all over Max Verstappen. But in typical 2023 fashion, Ferrari used their tyres harder than Red Bull, and Verstappen got to the lead. And when he did get to the lead, he left the field for dead. Ferrari, at least though, did manage to get one driver on the podium, and Charles Leclerc also finished in P4, meaning Ferrari were rewarded with moving up to P3 in the Constructors' Championship. Going into the Singapore Grand Prix though, they are potentially on the back foot a little bit when compared to their closest rivals, as Ferrari have struggled at this type of circuit more than their rivals have this year. Not only this, but with Ferrari being especially hard on tyres, this could be a difficult race weekend for them. That being said though, Ferrari have a strong track record at Singapore, so it could be better than it looks so far. For Carlos Sainz, he took the podium for Ferrari in Monza, but he was harder on his tyres when compared to Charles Leclerc, and really only maintained P3 by cutting the Della Roggia chicane, sending it over the chicane despite Leclerc technically being ahead of him into that corner on one of the laps. For Leclerc, it was a race weekend where he struggled with pace over one lap against his teammate, and in the early stages of the race he didn't quite have the pace. Leclerc has struggled a lot more when grip is lower this year, so it will be interesting to see how Charles gets on with the streets of Singapore. For Mercedes, going into the Singapore Grand Prix, they will be looking a little bit more competitive. In Monza, they were stronger than Aston Martin and McLaren, however they were a long way away from Ferrari. Going into Singapore, they should be stronger than Ferrari, and it will be close with Alonso in the Aston Martin and the two McLaren cars. Mercedes may not be as fast as McLaren when it comes to one-lap pace, however the race pace of Mercedes should not be ignored, and provided they can ride the curbs, which can sometimes be an issue for them, then there is no reason why we cannot see one of the Mercs on the podium. Hamilton and Russell both got involved in somewhat silly incidents during the race last time out at Monza, but thankfully for them it resulted in penalties that meant absolutely nothing. Russell had a return to form at Monza after struggling a lot more than Hamilton in recent races. Last year's race was a bit of a disaster for George, and he will be looking to put that right this year. For Hamilton, provided he can get the balance right, he could have a strong race, but Mercedes will probably have no chance against the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. And for Red Bull heading into Singapore, they are looking like they are still in fine form. Sergio Perez will be thankful that they are heading back to a street circuit, as this is typically where he performs better. Although the less being said about Monaco, the better. Perez, however, needs to make sure he can get qualifying correct. This is always the trickiest part of the weekend for Checo, and if he doesn't get it right here, he will be in trouble in the race. For Max Verstappen, however, though, qualifying will still also be the hardest part of the weekend for him, but it's likely he will still probably end up on the front row of the grid, unlike Checo if he gets it slightly wrong. But the race itself, it feels somewhat inevitable for Max Verstappen, that even if he's not on pole position, his superior tyre wear and his pure pace during the race means he will find a way by and probably win the race quite easily. So what are my predictions for the race? Well, for qualifying, I'm going to go somewhat aggressive with my options and say Lando Norris will be on pole position, as McLaren will be looking strong over one lap, and I do believe he can get pole position. But what about the race itself? Well, in P5, I'm going to go for Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. P4 will be Sergio Perez in the Red Bull, as I do think he will have an issue in qualifying and qualify a lot further down than he really should be. P3 will be Lando Norris in the McLaren, Lewis Hamilton will be P2, and Max Verstappen will win the Singapore Grand Prix, with Pierre Gasly being the top midfield driver. But that is what I think. The question is though, what do you guys think? In the comments down below, let me know, and as always, comment, leave a like, and subscribe for more F1 content. Thank you all so much for watching.